Hello and welcome again to 2025. This video will vary between commentary on Robert Sudy's statements and addressing him directly, since it will be posted on the thread where most of our exchanges have taken place. Robert Sudy, whose treasonous support of the legalised system of belligerent violence currently masquerading as law in Australia, was repudiated in videos 81 and 82, has recently resurfaced on another Facebook thread. He regurgitates the same morally indigestible tripe as before, but this time throws in some abusive personal assertions for good measure. Here's a starting point as good as any other. Quote, John Locke questioned my words, saying the invocation of Article 61 has been rejected by dozens of Australian High Court decisions since 1905. That's a good trick, considering it was only invoked in 2001, right before he blocked me taking off with his tail between his legs. Unquote. It is true that I temporarily blocked him as I was holidaying and couldn't be bothered with trying to argue principles of morality with one whose basic philosophy is that the most violent individual or group is legitimately the repository and administrator of what he calls law, but which in reality is only a system of rules devised by some to be inflicted by force for personal profit on anyone who doesn't accept that as legitimate. This is the objective definition of a legal system, and has no point of contact with any system of natural law. Because his posts and my replies are too lengthy to fit into a short video such as this, the full texts may be found on my Telegram channel, also called Locked On Article 61. It is interesting that at one point Mr. Sudy states his membership of the Gumbaynggirr nation, and his statement that this and hundreds of other independent sovereign nations were following variations of Madain law, on which he expands briefly. Quote, Madain law is not man-made law. It was created by Bayami, creator, God and father in the dreaming, and maintained since time immemorial. Take, for example, the story of Durangun and Biragan I told you a few days ago. All geological evidence indicates that event happened approximately 170 million years ago. How did Gumbaynggirr know of this? Bayami was there and told them, and the story has been passed over thousands of generations to the present day. End quote. So, despite his claims of being entirely rational, Mr. Sudy openly admits to what would accurately be classed as religious belief, that is, the adherence to myths or stories which have been passed down through generations but have no objective scientific verification. When asked by his correspondent which system of law he then would prefer to be in place, this is his response, quote, It has nothing to do with what I prefer, but what is. And what is, and continues to be, the true law of this continent is the Madain law system. Everything else has been imposed by the colonial occupation, end quote. Yet when abusing me for being irrational for calling out what he hereby admits is an illegitimately imposed artificial construct of legalism, he apparently has no problem with the obvious contradictions in these two positions. Indeed, he resorts to personal abuse and profane epithets because, unlike him, I haven't become involved in personal physical altercations with police, eventually resulting in a few terms of incarceration. Here's what he says I should be doing, quote, If you want to rebel in a revolution of sorts, you do not need to look to some outdated and provably obsolete document for permission to do so. You must fucking do it. You form a strategy, take up arms, and just do it. And you do so with acceptance that the full force of the law and military might, if it gets that far, will be applied to you and your band of merry men. You must be prepared to kill and be killed in your war. You do not rant about an 800-year-old piece of paper from another nation as some excuse not to do so, coward. You do not rant about me being a public enemy guilty of treason as if that means something. You visit me and put me in the ground, coward. Do you want my address? I think you will bite off more than you can chew." End quote. Apparently, the concept of realizing that a tiny handful of dissenters understand that they cannot win a physical conflict with a massive corporate machinery equipped for violence, and must of necessity find a more subtle means of first weakening the hold of that machinery over the minds of those they currently enslave, then eventually winning the war of public relations with that tyranny, even if that takes more than one lifetime, escapes the thought processes of Robert Sudy. He might gain some insights from the study of the American Revolution, the establishment of the Irish Free State, and other instances of the successful applications of the principles of guerrilla warfare. But of course, having become an abusive advocate of a system which he on one hand declares to be invalid, and on the other upholds as valid because it's more violently successful than the one he really supports in his heart, it's clear that he would love to see those calling out his adopted system of rules smash themselves to pulp in an orgy of mindless violent conflict. If that happened, the ideas of the dissenters would almost certainly die with them, at least for many decades, even centuries, and the risk of him having to answer for his own treason one day would very likely be expunged. Sorry, Mr. Sudy, but I and others like me see no sense in conforming to your wishes. You've no doubt heard the saying, there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And we continue to labour with the concept of winning the war of ideas, not that of impaling ourselves on the pikestaffs of tyrants' henchmen. So let's turn our attention to Mr. Sudy's personal accusations. There is more than one occasion in the threads where he calls me a coward for not physically fighting with police or walking into the fake corporate courts that exist now and asking them to trash my life, as apparently was done to him. Because he can't find a record of me in the legal register of convictions, this to him indicates that I don't really uphold my views. Perhaps he's unaware that Michael Collins, the leader of the Irish guerrilla struggle against the British from 1916 until 1921, when the Free State was agreed to by Westminster, was wholly unknown to British intelligence services until that date. They knew his name, but had no photograph, and none in the British government knew what he looked like until he walked into that room to meet with Churchill and discuss terms. Obviously, I can't and don't compare myself with such an illustrious resistor of tyranny as Michael Collins, but it's not a bad example to aspire to in terms of applying intelligence rather than personal belligerence in the quest for some measure of success, is it? But I posed a question in return. You accuse me of cowardice, Mr. Sudy, but I wonder if that isn't a form of sociopathic projection, where the accuser attempts to label his intended victim with the same behaviour as they are themselves exhibiting. You are, after all, a proponent of the view that the law has nothing to do with morality, which means there must be some other purpose to the system you espouse. It can't be about justice, because that surely is the only justification for any laws, that when wrongs are committed, the meaning and purpose of justice is to restore as closely as possible the circumstances which existed prior to the offence. No, your comments clearly indicate that you support the concept of rule by violence, by whomever is capable of amassing the more potent machinery for such. Isn't that a classic definition of a bully, Mr. Sudy? And it's common knowledge that bullies are at heart themselves cowards. I think most people understand that. You're completely fearless about inviting a septuagenarian to a physical confrontation. But some time ago, on your own admission, you switched sides from being a tough guy who found that there are those even tougher to becoming a paid-up member of the big boys gang. Bravo. The question that intrigues us, Mr. Sudy, is this. When you were a young gun travelling around the country without a driving licence, as indeed you should be able to, we agree there, were you really a freedom fighter? Or more along the lines of a mugler who got knocked around and realised you weren't going far behaving like that? If the latter, that speaks to the basically criminal background, which you proudly touted on your original posts on the thread of Professor Toomey's Constitutional Clarion video. If the former, a freedom fighter turned by repeated applications of force against yourself into an advocate, presumably for pay, of a violent, coercive system of slavery, some might classify that as the behaviour of a turncoat. So which is it? Once a crim, always a crim? Or someone who switches sides for personal advantage? Of course, if he were originally just a young blade exercising his lawful rights to freedom of movement, etc., those are only termed crimes by the people you now support. To people with an understanding of moral or natural law, those aren't criminal actions. At least not up to the point where you cause someone harm. Perhaps that's where the stoushes with the police came into the picture. Regardless, what you're supporting now is criminal, involving inflicting harm on people who haven't harmed others, so we know where you now stand. Those who follow the links to the threads between me and Robert Sudy will note that he has umpteen examples of quotes from learned members of the legal profession, from Cook down to Australian examples like Griffith et al. He derides me for not being trained in the legal profession and yet purporting to correct the errors of these eminences of legalism. He claims that I produce no evidence for my claims, yet the notices I and others send are comprised of nothing but evidence of the treason of those which led to the invocation of Article 61 and their continued actions since. He clearly hasn't read either Article 61 or the notices. They are irrefutable and follow the rules of honourable conduct laid down by their own legal system. This sticks in the craw of these hypocrites, which is why the courts, Mr. Sudy lionises, criminally refuse to acknowledge them, thus committing open treason in public view. My response is to ask a few simple questions of Mr. Sudy. He obviously doesn't accept me as someone whose views on law are acceptable. This is his quote, "Who are you, some guy ranting on YouTube about what the law should be," end quote. Fair enough question, but so is my response to him. Who are you to say what the law should be? Aren't we all supposed to be equal before the law and have the same rights? And even further, who are Cook and the other names you constantly reference to say what the law should be? They may be more learned in a fake, concocted system of enforcement which has no connection to natural law, but where do they obtain the right to make rules which you, I, or indeed any other member of society must obey? The answer is they do not obtain it. It's a blatant usurpation. Is it not true that no single member of society has any innate right to overrule and dictate to another? If that is so, how can such actions lay claim to any validity or compliance with natural law? All people of conscience are bound by natural law, which is to say, if we act outside those boundaries, it's accepted that there are consequences to come. It's only criminals who don't accept that principle. Do you deny that you have a conscience, Mr. Sudy? Can you discern the difference between right and wrong action? If you can, then you have to admit that the law, the instrument by which society seeks to maintain justice, must be cognizant of people's consciences and must therefore have a relationship with morality. To say that it doesn't or oughtn't to have any such relationship is to deny the existence of one's conscience, isn't it? That is an obvious internal contradiction in your arguments, and when one finds a contradiction, one checks one's premises. When we do that, we invariably find that at least one of our premises is incorrect. Time for you to do some shadow work, Mr. Sudy. There are some murky spots inside you which need exposure to light. You may not like the flavour of light I dispense, but perhaps you may gain some enlightenment from the work of William Keyte on lawandalchemy.org. I include a reference to his latest video in the comments box. We learn more effectively by understanding than by memorizing. Just remember, Mr. Sudy, if it doesn't exist in nature, it isn't real. Thank you for watching.